Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today here on a Tuesday. And if you'd like to join our conversation at any point, feel free to give us a call, 1-800-351-1212. A little bit later this hour, we're going to be talking with Travis Weber, and he is the director of the Center for Religious Liberty at the Family Research Council. And we're going to have him talk a little bit about some of the skits, in particular, one in particular, but there's some others we might get into as well that Jimmy Kimmel has done. And Jimmy Kimmel has every right to do anything he thinks might bring a laugh, although I'm not so sure some of these are even intended to get people to laugh. Instead, he's sort of felt like he's the conscience of America. That's his freedom. But he's not free to misrepresent, in particular, one of the cases before the Supreme Court right now. And for individuals, and we know that there are a number who get all of their news from watching Jimmy Fallon or Jimmy Kimmel or somebody like that, Stephen Colbert, and know nothing else, they will assume that if the Supreme Court rules in favor, for example, with Jack Phillips, Masterpiece Cake Bakery, that this would then give people license to deny service to anybody who they disagreed with in terms of their sexual orientation. Nothing could be further from the truth. So we're going to spend some time talking about that and also just getting into some of those religious liberty cases. So that will be something we will talk about a good portion of our first hour. Second hour, a little bit later, we will have John Whitehead with us. He is a constitutional attorney. Of course, you are familiar with him. He's been with the Rutherford Institute since he started it, and as an individual that has written about, for example, A Government of Wolves, the Emerging American Police State, also Battlefield America, the War on the American People. Those are a couple of books I've got in studio with me, and we will really be focusing on this issue of surveillance and privacy. And I have posted one of his articles on the website, and also one by a very significant liberal commentator, John Cass, writing for the Chicago Tribune. Where's the liberal outrage over civil liberties in the Flynn case? And time again, we're seeing that those who used to say they were concerned about some of these issues, like civil liberties, sort of turn a blind eye when it happens to somebody in the Trump administration. And so we're going to get into that as well. And to use that as maybe one short illustration, I have been sort of waiting until now to talk about this particular case that involved the Attorney General, Jeff Sessions. Now, let me give you some history. A little bit earlier this month, he was actually speaking to the National Sheriff's Association, and he actually used a term which, candidly, was correctly used. It was in the proper context, and it generated a firestorm, at least on Twitter and some of the other social media. Now, the outrage surfaced almost immediately when he said this: the office of sheriff is a crucial part of the Anglo-American heritage of law enforcement. Now, I think most of you that are listeners to Point of View go, and what's controversial about that? Well, it was that he used the word Anglo-American. And let me just quote from one U.S. senator. His Twitter feed's probably illustrative of so many others. This senator said, "Do you know anyone who says Anglo-American heritage in a sentence? What could possibly be the purpose of saying that other than to pit Americans against each other? For the chief law enforcement officer to use a dog whistle like that is appalling." And this is one of those examples, which we'll talk about in just a minute when we get with Travis Weber when we talk about Jimmy Kimmel, Are you just ignorant of the case, or are you just manipulating it because you don't like Donald Trump? Because if you're ignorant, then let's do some education. The word sheriff, where does that come from? Well, the word sheriff comes from two words, shire and reef. And so actually that was a word that was given to individuals who were law enforcement officers in England. Did you ever read, Robin Hood? Remember the sheriff? What was he? Sheriff of Nottingham. Of course, he was a law enforcement individual. And that's where this idea of having a local law enforcement officer, in this case, he plays a bad guy in Robin Hood, but these sheriffs were those in England. And of course, we have sheriffs in the United States. So to be perfectly honest, the Attorney General was quite proper in reminding the sheriffs that they're part of the Anglo-American heritage of law enforcement. Now, if that's not enough, as soon as this came out, the good news is there are a lot of people that have access to Google or Nexus. And Charlie Cook, writing for National Review, just did that and did us a great service, because if you want to find his article, it's on National Review, but he actually was able to dig up multiple times when Senator Barack Obama or President Barack Obama talked about, in one case, the Anglo-American legal system. He talked about the foundation of Anglo-American law. And, of course, none of those were controversial because, after all, I think what was happening here were individuals that were just trying to find some way to score some political points by criticizing the Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, and ultimately criticizing the President, Donald Trump. But I also love what our good friend John Zmirak says, that really the Anglo-American heritage refers to a lot more than just sheriff or quaint things like jury duty. It taps into our values, our institutions, and it benefits more than 1 billion people around the world, from the United States to India, from Kenya to Hong Kong. Many of them don't speak English, but they're mostly thankful for those legal principles that come from our Anglo-American heritage. What would those be? That'd be things like the right to remain silent, the right to have an attorney represent you in a court of law, the right to bear arms. Of course, we've been talking about that over the last couple of days. The right to have an attorney provided for you if you cannot afford one. The idea of the presumption of innocence. Even the idea that we have an adversarial system of justice rather than an inquisition. Then the protections. For example, protections against invasive searches in our home. In the second hour, we're going to be talking about that with John Whitehead. Where did our Fourth Amendment protections go? Equality before the law. We have an equal standing before the law. Even the idea of firm, clear property rights, which are immune from arbitrary seizure. Freedom of religion, which we're going to talk about in just a minute with Travis Weber. Freedom of assembly. And even, if you will, the freedom of speech, except for things like slander, libel, or incitement to violence. So I think it's about time maybe to remind some of these critics who are so critical of the Attorney General that they enjoy these constitutional rights and many more that I could possibly work my way list through. And that includes the freedom of speech. Even the freedom to say some pretty stupid things, which is exactly what they said when they criticized the Attorney General the other day for talking about our Anglo-American heritage. Nothing else, every once in a while, when somebody says something erroneous, stupid, or just wrong-headed, sometimes we can use that as an opportunity to do a little bit of education here at Point of View and talk about the value of this Anglo-American heritage, which not only protects our rights here in the United States, but I love what John Zmirak points out. This has protected other individuals, many of whom do not even speak English, from the United States to India, from Kenya to Hong Kong. And those are some of the blessings that we enjoy here. And I'm grateful that we have those blessings and we have those rights. Let's take a break. When we come back, Travis Weber is going to be with us. We'll talk about Jimmy Kimmel and religious liberty. And, of course, if you'd like to join our conversation at any point, that number is 1-800-351-1212. We'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, for the last few decades, politicians and high-tech companies have been talking about the digital divide. They wanted to make sure that poor and underprivileged students have access to the same digital devices as wealthier ones. I've always felt that there was a bigger issue that fewer people were talking about. Fortunately, Naomi Schaefer Riley addresses this in her New York Times op-ed on America's real digital divide. She warns that if you think middle-class children are being harmed by too much screen time, just consider how much greater the damage is to minority and disadvantaged kids who spend much more time in front of screens. One study, for example, found that minority children watch 50% more TV than their white peers. They use computers for up to 1.5 hours longer each day, and the amount of time Black and Hispanic children spend in front of any screen is substantially longer each day than for white children. Another study found that every additional hour of TV increased a child's odds of attention problems by about 10%. Kids who watched 3 hours a day were 30% more likely to have attention problems than those who watched none. The push from politicians and educators has been to bridge the digital divide and get computers and other technology into the classrooms. Apparently, minority students already have access to technology. One Pew Research report documents that African American teenagers are more likely to own a smartphone than any other group of teenagers in America. Put simply, the problem today is not a lack of technology in the schools, in the homes, in the hands of young people. The problem is too much technology. They're spending a significant number of hours each day in front of a TV screen, a video game screen, a computer screen, and a smartphone screen. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
From PureFlix, the biblical story of the last of the Hebrew judges, Samson. Rated PG-13. Samson now playing. Information at samson.movie.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
As we've mentioned before, and as I even mentioned just a few minutes ago, Jimmy Kimmel is supposed to be a comedian, but he sort of felt like he needs to be the conscience of America, and he's put on a number of skits, which I don't even think are all that funny. Maybe he thinks they are. But the point is that they are misrepresenting some really important cases. One of those, of course, is before the Supreme Court, and it has to do with Jack Phillips and Masterpiece Bakery. And we're going to get into some of the things that he has said and, in a sense, do some fact-checking and then get into the broader issue of religious liberty. So to help us out, we bring to the microphone Travis Weber, who is the director of the Center for Religious Liberty at the Family Research Council. A graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy, served as a Navy pilot, but also was the captain of the intercollegiate sailing team and was a two-time college sailing All-American. Since then, has degrees from, for example, Georgetown University Law School in International Law and a certificate in International Human Rights, as well as a Juris Doctor from Regent University School of Law, and an individual that has been writing about some of those issues. And we've posted this article on our website, pointofview.net, including a picture, just kind of a snapshot of the skit that Jimmy Kimmel was involved in. And Travis, thank you so very much for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thanks for having me on.
I said before you came on the air, and I'll say it again, Jimmy Kimmel has free speech, and aren't we glad we have free speech? And he's free to say anything he wants, but he's not free to avoid the consequences of miscommunicating some pretty significant issues. And if people go to our website, pointofview.net, or if they go to Family Research Council, frc.org, you will see the picture. And there's a picture of Jimmy Kimmel pretending to be a waiter. There are 4 people around the table, and it looks like a typical kind of situation until
he finds out that one of them is, quote, gay, and then informs this woman that indeed the chef can't make her salad because he believes homosexuality is a sin. Now, at so many levels, that's inaccurate, but take us through why you decided to write about this and why we need to do our best to try to do some fact-checking here.
Yeah, because, first and foremost, I decided to write about this because the skit is just inaccurate, and people do take a lot of their cues from comedy sketches like this. So it's important to be aware that, we may say, well, I'm watching this because it seems funny to me, but we go away from that with a perception of what happened in this wedding business context that's just inaccurate. So that's kind of why I decided to address it. First off the bat, he portrays this as though the business owners, which he plays as the waiter, are quizzing people as to whether they're gay or not when they come into the place of business, which is just not true. That's not happening. It doesn't happen in the Jack Phillips case, in the California case that was recently decided, Baronel Stutzman's case, or any of them. These wedding vendors have often had long-standing relationships, and at least in Baronel Stutzman's case, friendships with the customers. They know they're gay, and they're happy to serve them items off of their shelves in their places of business. What they don't want to do is use their abilities to create something which celebrates the same-sex marriage that they disagree with. So that's the fundamental difference between how Kimmel portrays this as though it's business owners quizzing people on their sexuality, not happening, and reality, which is the business owners saying, we want to continue to live in peace, but they're being requested to participate in this celebration. They don't want to against their conscience. That's fundamentally different. It's important that people understand that.
Let's talk about that for a minute before we get to one of the other errors, and that is, Kelly Shackelford, and he is almost always here on a Friday. Will be this Friday with us, as well as Jeremy Dice, so they're both from First Liberty. And one of the arguments that Kelly Shackelford makes, and I want to see if you agree with it, is that this is more than just sort of a live and let live. This is where the government says, I can compel you to use your artistic ability, whether it's designing a cake or drawing a picture, whether it's taking a photograph, designing flowers, whatever it might be. And we are in a very dangerous territory when the government can compel you to do something that goes against your conscience. We don't force people to do too many things. We force them to pay taxes and to obey the laws, but this goes beyond that, don't you think?
Absolutely. That's the fundamental point that we want to communicate to people, is that the government should not be penalizing people who are trying to live their lives in peace. This is a matter of government discrimination, and all we're asking for when we advocate for religious freedom is that people be left alone from the government telling them, you must agree with same-sex marriage or else you will not be able to operate your business. You will not be able to do work with the government through contracts or grants. You will not be recognized as tax exempt. That's what we're advocating for. And, Kimmel's skit portrays the small business owner as the big bad wolf. In reality, this skit would have been more accurate if he had been portraying the government and the people at the table were these small business owners, because what's happening in all these cases, government power is being brought to bear on the small business owners trying to live out their faith in peace, and the government's coming to them and saying, you better agree with me or, in essence, get out of my restaurant, to use the context of the Jimmy Kimmel skit. That's actually what's happening, and if people study these cases and how they develop and don't just believe the first characterization of the case that they hear, they'll understand that that's what's going on.
And again, as I pointed out, a lot of individuals, hopefully not a majority, but a lot of individuals do get their news and information from Jimmy Fallon, Jimmy Kimmel, Stephen Colbert. They don't watch the evening news, and so they have a perception here that some kind of bias or bigotry is behind that. You talk about in your article here that this was a missed opportunity, because he could have been talking about how this was a deeply held faith commitment and how important, really, faith has been a part of the American history since its beginnings, right?
Yeah. I mean, Jimmy Kimmel could have portrayed, given the story of the baker, of the California baker, of Baronel Stutzman, of Jack Phillips. I mean, these are stories to tell. There are people behind these, and when you ignore them, you're not being fair to the dynamic of what's going on in these situations, because certainly the potential customers who have to go elsewhere to get their cake, they have the story, and that's being told, but the small business owners are not being told. Their stories are not being told. And, to take the case of Jack Phillips, the potential customers there could have received their cake from 67 other bakeries, including one only a half a mile away in the Denver area, yet they wanted to force Jack Phillips to bake it against his conscience. And, his story is, look, I have no problem if they go half a mile down the road and get the cake. Just don't force me to be involved. That's a story that needs to be told, and when people understand that, they see that the situation is not quite as they perceived it.
Let's give Jimmy Kimmel some credit, because his skit does talk about where he references a Hindu chef who didn't want to prepare a steak for a potential customer because of his religious beliefs. Talk about that, if you might.
Yeah, I mean, this is interesting. He uses this reference because it's in some ways a reference to religious freedom and desiring to honor conscience. I mean, if a chef is forced to pulled off the street and forced to prepare something off his conscience, I mean, it's a scenario that it probably isn't going to happen, right? But suppose it does happen, we would say, don't make that guy violate his conscience. Why are you going to force him to do that when you can have someone else prepare the meal? We could understand that, and so Kimmel, by referencing, a chef who would live out those beliefs, but force the customer to eat the steak, to eat the meal he prepared, we can understand that in this reference, what Kimmel, he has his finger on a religious freedom issue, but he doesn't quite frame it properly. And so, this is something that we need to ensure that the public understands and clarify and correct these situations when we come across them. And that's what I attempted to do here.
Well, let's take a break, and when we come back, we will continue our conversation. Well, let me open up the phones. Maybe you have some questions. Travis Weber with us, director of the Center for Religious Liberty at Family Research Council, and we just sort of mentioned in passing some of these cases, and I thought it might be good to rehearse them again. We do talk about those from time to time, but, whether we were talking about a photographer in New Mexico or a florist in Washington State or bakers in Oregon or Colorado or innkeepers in New York or a variety of others, there are a number of these religious liberty cases that all involve sort of this issue of conscience protection. And so if you have some comments or questions about that, maybe even some of you that have been wondering about how this would affect you. I know a while back I had someone call in and say, I've been making T-shirts, and this case out of Kentucky seems like I might not have to then be forced to make T-shirts with messages I would disagree with, but where does that stand? So Travis Weber will give us a little bit of a hint on where maybe the Supreme Court case will go, some of these other cases that may end up in the Supreme Court, and kind of where the status is, because we've had kind of conflicting decisions. In California, one decision, Colorado, a different one. So we'll come back and sort that out. But if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212, 1-800-351-1212. We'll be right back.
With the way things are going right now, there's got to be a source of truth somewhere.
Eric lives in California, and he's listened to Point of View since he was a child hanging around his dad's auto shop in Nevada. He says it's his only trustworthy source of information about what's happening in the world.
Well, I feel bad because I have not been donating, and I'll tell you what, I'm getting back to that because just recently I realized with all the junk going on, with all the media, with all these news things, the only one that I count on is you guys. And what would I do if you guys weren't there? I don't know what I'd do. Where would I get my news? And I would be dead in water. So I got to do my part.
Make sure you do your part, like Eric. Join the Truth Team. Get all the details by calling 1-800-347-5151 or visit online, pointofview.net/team. Support the truth and make a difference for the future. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team. Point of View will continue after this.
You're listening to Point of View.
The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Travis Weber with us for just a few more minutes, and if you'd like to join our conversation, that number is 1-800-351-1212, talking about religious liberty. He is the director of the Center for Religious Liberty at the Family Research Council. And Travis, before we get back into some of the content, let's talk about what people will find when they land at the website frc.org. First of all, we always encourage people to get the Washington Watch and to really learn a little bit more about what's going on. But if they also click on the, if you will, menu, or else just frc.org/religious-liberty, that will take them to a section in which you've got all sorts of articles as well as publications. So talk about some of the resources that are available to some of our listeners.
Yeah, I mean, if you go to Religious Liberty, it'll take you to our website with Religious Liberty Issues Focus, and that includes a pamphlet, an introduction to our Freedom to Believe, which I drafted recently to discuss an overview of religious liberty and some basic illustrations of why we should engage on that issue. Related to that is other FRC publications, and you'll see on the left side of the page our other issues, life issues, marriage and family issues, and the issues that are underneath those. So there's a lot there. We encourage people to go there, find out more about what we are doing, and you can sign up for different communications and email lists that you'd like to receive.
Let's talk about that for just a minute, because your pamphlet, which is very helpful, an introduction to our Freedom to Believe, all about religious liberty, and that would be one I would recommend. But then you really deal with some really practical questions that churches are dealing with. For example, one of those is, can pastors and churches be forced to perform same-sex marriage? Or what about the future for tax exemption for churches? These are really important issues, and I know those of us that talk about these issues day to day kind of know the answers to that. But I would venture to say, Travis, that there are a lot of pastors, Sunday school leaders, Bible fellowship leaders, small group leaders who wouldn't really know the answers to those questions. But the good news is you've taken the time to research them, haven't you?
Yeah, well, I have one publication that addresses that question. Can pastors and churches be forced to perform same-sex marriages? There's also a publication on there about tax exemption of churches. The first one that I mentioned, though, it's a question that came up a lot after the Supreme Court's Obergefell decision, which constitutionalized same-sex marriage. People are naturally curious about it. After the Obergefell decision, I took a look at that question and concluded basically that it's very unlikely at that point that churches would be forced to perform same-sex marriages based on a number of constitutional and other legal protections. And that's still basically the case. But if we look, at this issue more broadly, it's especially an interesting time now to ask this question, because FRC recently engaged on a situation in Michigan outside Detroit in which a pastor has come under incredible hostility and vitriol from the culture, basically just other citizens, Americans out there, and some news media, for simply offering a counseling program that would assist kids with asking biblically how do they deal with same-sex attraction. So
right.
This is really just a program and a forum to talk about that. This guy has been demonized, though, and he's a pastor. And two Democratic legislators in that state have asked the Attorney General to open an investigation into the church. This is alarming to see a church be targeted like this, and it should clue us all in, Christians who are around the country who may agree with a biblical position on sexuality but really not see the threat, should clue us all into the fact that churches will eventually be targeted. And this is the type of thing which shows that your biblical beliefs will eventually be penalized and be brought under threat.
You know, one of the wake-up calls I've always said happened in Houston, because sometimes pastors say, you know, I'll leave it to the lawyers in my congregation, or maybe there's a individual that's run for political office, maybe in city council or something, but we'll leave the politics to them because it's really not going to affect us. And then when pastors were aware that other pastors in Houston had their sermons subpoenaed by the mayor. How many times do we even pay attention, to be perfectly honest, who we elect to city council, who we elect as mayor? We should, but I recognize a lot of Christians aren't. But that was, I think, a wake-up call to say, you know, this idea that, well, we'll be in our sphere in the church and you be in your sphere in politics and the two will never touch each other. That's not happening. And if we don't begin to educate the next generation about the importance of really being good citizens and exercising their civic duty, we're going to find that more and more of these cases are going to show up at our doorstep there at the church.
Very true. And I believe that this situation in Michigan now is another one along the lines of the Houston situation, where you have an egregious overstep into the autonomy of the church. Now, you know, Christians around the country who really are not even engaged on social or political matters should be alarmed by this, because even if they want to be left alone in their churches, as long as they're following a biblical position on sexuality, that brings them under the umbrella of the threats here, which are threats to investigate a church for following a biblical position on sexuality. And that's what this comes down to. It should alarm people. Hope they realize that this is occurring and we're trying to spread the word so that people are engaged in a larger context. It's not to be alarmist for the sake of being alarmist, rather say, look, this is actually what's happening, and need to challenge people's paradigms and their sense of complacency here.
Let's just, before I let you go, also talk about the circumstances that many of my listeners find themselves in. I've had people call in and say, you know, we got a floral shop and it's in North Carolina, and we're not really getting the kind of pushback that, say, Barronelle Stutzman have in Washington, but what could happen? I've had people call in and say, you know, I actually silkscreen T-shirts. What about that? We have a bakery in Georgia, and what's going to happen there? I think a fair amount of the answers to that will come from this particular case. Now, the court could, in this case with Jack Phillips, just narrowly rule that the overreaction from Colorado was too much and that they were out of line constitutionally. So they may not rule broadly, but if it isn't this case, it might be Aaron and Melissa Klein's case out of Oregon. But one of these cases, I think, is either going to establish that you indeed can be compelled to do things that violate your religious conscience or not. Don't you think that that is certainly going to be a ruling, if not in this case, one of the cases soon, and maybe answer the question for some of my listeners?
Very, very much so, at least in the context of public accommodations, non-discrimination law on sexual orientation. And by that, basically, we mean places of business, the intersection between that requirement and First Amendment constitutional rights. One of these cases will address that question and whether these people have the First Amendment right to live out their beliefs, their speech, or free exercise of religion. And, you know, I think one other point to remember about this is important to communicate. Jack Phillips, in his brief at the Supreme Court, made the point that even if he would not create a same-sex wedding cake, even if the people asking him for that cake were of heterosexual orientation, even if they identified that way, yet he would make a cake for a heterosexual wedding, a wedding between a man and a woman, even if the one purchasing it identified as homosexual or part of the LGBT community. And this so clearly shows what we've been trying to communicate here, which is it's not about people who identify that way being turned away, but rather it's about Jack Phillips not being forced to create something against his conscience. If this point can be communicated to the public and to judges and legislators, I think we will see more and more people with the understanding that, look, these people, these business owners just want to be left alone and live out their faith. They're not trying to pick a fight or do something that's unacceptable in the eyes of much of the country. This is very important to communicate. And yes, one of these cases, whether it's Jack Phillips or another one, I think, you know, the court's going to issue a decision in that case. And I think that decision will be very important to establishing a general framework for how our country is going to decide to look at freedom and First Amendment rights in this context.
Well, again, that's why we need to support groups like Family Research Council that are giving us a fact check on some of the things that maybe come from Jimmy Kimmel or from mainstream media, blogs, Facebook, and all the rest. So certainly want you to go to frc.org, and there's a section there on religious liberty. This booklet, 14 pages, covers great material. And Travis, thank you for writing that, and say hello to Tony Perkins.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
We will do this again, and you can find out more about Travis, more about FRC, Family Research Council, more about religious liberty, more about that booklet. So all of it available at our website, pointofview.net. Let me open up the phones again. I did want to hear from him, but I'd also love to hear from you. 1-800-351-1212. If you have some comments about this issue of religious liberty, public accommodations, and some of those issues that I think may or may not be resolved. The Supreme Court may decide not to decide. I got a feeling that we're going to get a ruling that's going to start in the right direction, so we'll see what happens. Of course, we won't know that till June, but if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. We'll be right back.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. It's not every day that the governor of a state finds himself behind the pulpit of a church. But I guess not every state is Texas. Greg Abbott, governor of the great state of Texas, joined Pastor Steve Riggle and churchgoers at Grace Community Church recently to sign a bill into law. The bill that passed at the Texas legislature made it unlawful for the government to force religious leaders to turn over copies of sermons during a civil lawsuit or administrative proceeding. And if you don't think such a law is necessary, recall that the pastor of the church Governor Abbott was in that day was asked by the mayor of Houston to turn over his sermons, even though he wasn't even party to a lawsuit. If that's not enough, recall that Dr. Eric Walsh, himself a lay minister, was fired by the state of Georgia over something he said in a sermon. And after he sued the state of Georgia, Georgia's attorney general subpoenaed copies of Dr. Walsh's sermons, sermon notes, and sermon transcripts. So the day has come in which we need laws on the books to make it clear that the state is not entitled to review a pastor's sermons. The pulpit has rightly been called the sacred desk. The promise of America has been that he who fills that desk is entitled to speak what his conscience demands. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
More people today are saying Americans don't really need religion, but America does need religion. Religion helps the economy, families, and even national security. Learn more by reading Saving America, 10 Reasons Religious Freedom is the Key to Our Nation's Future. You can download this free booklet at firstliberty.org/Saving America. That's firstliberty.org/Saving America. Discover 10 ways religion benefits America at firstliberty.org/Saving America.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
We'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Sometimes when we talk about these cases and we talk about how an individual's had to defend himself or herself before the court, we fail to sometimes talk about some of the successes. And I thought I'd talk about two real quickly. Our listeners in California might be familiar with one of these cases where you have a bakery owner, Kathy Miller, and her bakery is called Tasty's Bakery. and told this particular lesbian couple that she could not in good conscience create a cake for their wedding because it was a same-sex wedding, a marriage in California, which is legal. And in that particular case, the Kern County Superior Court judge actually ruled that this would be okay for her to do so. So even before we have the Supreme Court decision, we do have an occasional case like that that is ruled in favor of an individual's religious liberty. Just a minute ago, I mentioned T-shirts, and this series of cases that have come out of some of these places have been really interesting, because Blaine Adamson, owner of one of those particular cases, faced discrimination charges because he turned down a homosexual who wanted him to print rainbow T-shirts for a gay pride parade. And so he was brought before the city commissioners and accused of discrimination. But in this case, he, as I just want to mention again, was exonerated. The court ruled that he did not have to give up his religious liberty because some homosexual activists demanded he print a rainbow T-shirt. And in particular cases, they said we wouldn't require an artist to paint a picture that he or she did not agree with. Likewise, companies or individuals printing T-shirts should not be told how to use their artistic expression. And I thought it was kind of interesting that to see the support that he received, because he had other T-shirt shop owners, in one case homosexuals themselves, who said they recognized the right to decline business if they disagreed with that. One woman, for example, I assume a lesbian, I shouldn't say that, but I take that from the article, said she doubted her business would print a T-shirt for the anti-gay Westboro Baptist Church. And if you go through these cases, whether it's Blaine Adamson or a variety of other T-shirt printers, or in the case that we mentioned just a minute ago of Jack Phillips, in most cases, what we're talking about here are individuals that have declined other things. Declined, for example, to hate gays or to promote Satanism, or I know Jack Phillips was not going to ever bake a cake to celebrate a divorce. So it isn't just that they are sort of anti-gay bigots that only are discriminating against those individuals. It is they are saying, look, if I'm going to put my creative talents to work on this, I need to put myself into it. And I can't sometimes put my head around actually trying to do a good job for someone whose message is one that I disagree with. And I think we all understand that. But again, this idea of live and let live, not trying to force or compel people to do things against their will, it's just something that sometimes goes one direction but doesn't seem to come the other direction. Well, let's go back and get some comments from you. 1-800-351-1212. We'll go to Missouri first. And Mark, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
How are you?
Very good. What would you like to add to our conversation?
Oh, I just telling a guy a while ago that my son was I was in class in college, and the teacher had opened up, just a discussion about anything that anybody wanted to talk about. I think it was English class, but anyway, so this one gal had got up, and she had made a statement that she felt like all pastors should have to be forced to perform same-sex marriage, weddings. And my son, he said, well, I don't know how in the world that forcing somebody to do something against their will like that is going to accomplish anything. And the majority of the class agreed with him. And this little gal kind of, I don't say get put in her place, but she sure, never said anything else after that. So I was, kind of proud of the fact that my son had stood up, because I am a pastor. And that, and to think that there are still, people out there that maybe think still yet the way that we think.
Well, and I think, so again, a lot of it is common sense. I've used the phrase more than once, live and let live. When homosexuality was seen as a minority and maybe even victimized and marginalized, and I won't try to defend everything that has ever been said about homosexuals and everything, but there was a time in which they really were easily vilified, and they said, look, we just want our fair share. We want to have equal standing before the law. And we said, well, you should have equal standing before the law. Your sexual orientation had nothing to do with it any more than race, sex, gender, anything else. But as soon as they began to get some victories, it was no longer, well, we want our rights. It's, no, we want you to affirm our views. And that seems to go against kind of the basic American ethic. And the basic American ethic is, you know, I may not agree with you, but I certainly give you the right to hold to those views. And we live and let live. You know, if we're neighbors and we may disagree about some political issues or issues of human sexuality, fine, we'll still be good neighbors to one another. But then when all of a sudden the individual says, no, you have to agree with everything I say, I don't care whether it's a radical right-winger or radical left-winger, that just seems to go against kind of American common sense and basic decency, don't you think?
Oh, yes, I do believe so. And we love everybody. If you're a Christian, you love, and that's just the way it is. And we're not out here, you know, trying to persecute people. But it seems like the more that we try to love people, at times the more we do get persecuted. And you know, it was just good to hear that my son, you know, told me that. And, you know, it still gave me just a little bit of hope because this was a college campus, and it's you know, a state campus, and so I imagine that it's got very liberal views in its teachers and professors and things such as this, but still yet some of the kids, I believe, given the chance, will sometimes make more right decisions than even the adults will.
Yes. Well, again, let me just say that your son also illustrates something we've talked about before. There's kind of been a liberal, a humanistic filibuster going on so often in these college campuses. But so many times I've seen that if one student puts up his hand and say, Professor, you know, I saw this quote the other day. What do you think about that? And it's amazing how just one student can kind of change the whole direction of the class. And he's did a good job. Let me real quickly try to jump over to Georgia, WAGP, Larry, and only got about a minute. What would you like to add?
I was wondering about the freedom from religion people, which I came from Kentucky, and they're having a big problem there now with the Carter County, Kentucky, where the students were having a prayer for the children that were killed or the people that were killed in Kentucky at the gunfire.
Sure.
And now they're being sued by the freedom from religion. And my point is that the freedom from religion, suing somebody that has freedom of religion, isn't that kind of an oxymoron there? I mean, if you have freedom from religion, then shouldn't we have freedom of religion?
I would think so.
In that case,
yeah.
Then, well, in that case, we should have the freedom to do what our religion dictates, which is prayer and not supporting the things that we don't support.
Yeah, free exercise. You know, First Amendment has both the free exercise clause and the establishment clause. Our freedom from religion folks only want to talk about the establishment part, not the free exercise. And Larry, I was thinking about covering this in the next segment, and so I'm hoping you can stay and listen, because I was going to pull a little bit out of my new book, Christians and Government, A Biblical Point of View. I've got a chapter there on separation of church and state. And let me, if I can, before we get John Whitehead on, at about quarter after, just do a little bit of educating and teaching on that, because you've raised a very good question. It deserves a longer answer, and I'll try to answer it in just a few minutes when we come back from the break. If you'd like to know more about some of the things we're talking about today, it's all available at the website, pointofview.net. We'll be right back.
From PureFlix comes Samson, the biblical story of the last of the Hebrew judges, from his anointing to betrayal to redemption.
My name is Samson, and you will face the wrath of God.
Samson, rated PG-13. May be inappropriate for children under 13. Now playing. More information is available at samson.movie.
Missing a day of Point of View is like Samson losing his hair. Now stay with me. Without his hair, Samson was weak, and ultimately he lost his sight. Without Point of View, you miss out on encouraging news, stories of how God is using Christians to make a difference. Instead of being strengthened, you get discouraged. And Point of View helps you see places to get involved, opportunities to apply your God-given gifts for good. Never miss a program, a Viewpoint's commentary, an important action item when you download the Point of View radio app, free from Google Play or iTunes. Take out your phone right now and download the Point of View radio app. See the difference you can make.
Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. Second hour today here on Point of View. In the first hour, we had a chance to talk with Travis Weber, and he is with the Center for Religious Liberty at the Family Research Council. Talked a little bit about some of the fact-checking on one of the skits by Jimmy Kimmel, and then got into some other religious liberty issues. And as we were ending the program in the first hour, Larry from Georgia called and said, you know, what about this idea of freedom from religion and freedom of religion? And so just before we get John Whitehead on, I want to do a little bit of that teaching from my book, Christians and Government, A Biblical Point of View. But let me just mention, to give you kind of a program note, just in about 10 or so minutes, we're going to have John Whitehead joining us. He is the author of such books as A Government of Wolves, The Emerging American Police State, Battlefield America, The War on the American People. We've posted his article, and this is one of many, called Surveillance and No Privacy. And I wanted to do this, one, because we're hearing all about this issue of surveillance. Number two, for those of you that are actually supporters of this ministry, if you have been part of the Truth Team, if you give at the $45 a month level, we provide all sorts of booklets. In the last couple of months, we've had booklets come out on Sharia law and on the politicized culture, making your vote count. Most recent one on homosexual theology. The newest one that hasn't been mailed yet, but will come to your doorstep very soon, is on surveillance and privacy. This is an issue we think really deserves some attention, especially in light of the surveillance of the Trump campaign and some of the scandal that is surfacing there. And I've also posted a piece by a liberal, man who calls himself progressive, so I'm not calling him anything that he's not, and that is John Cass says, where's the liberal outrage over civil liberties in the Flynn case? So we're going to get into that in just a minute with John Whitehead and talk about the surveillance that is taking place and how we used to have this expectation of privacy, and that no longer exists. He starts out, interesting enough, with a quote from William O. Douglas. We are rapidly entering the age of no privacy, where everyone is open to surveillance at all times, where there are no secrets from government. And he said that in 1966, and would have had no idea of the level of surveillance that we have now here in the 21st century. So we're going to spend some time talking about that. Let me come back and try to answer Larry's question. In my new book, Christians and Government, I have a chapter on separation of church and state. And first of all, you might ask people when they talk about separation of church and state, where it shows up in the Constitution. And if you've listened to this program any length of time, you know that I have pointed out that the word separation, the word church, and the word state, those words aren't even in the Constitution, much less the phrase. So where did it come from? Well, in 1802, you have Thomas Jefferson writing to the Danbury Baptist Association, and they were wondering about this issue of religious liberty. And so he borrowed a phrase that had been used before, and you can find a couple of places. Roger Williams talked about a wall of separation back in the 17th century. Timothy Dwight, a president at Yale, was concerned about whether or not Jefferson was going to deal with this appropriately, and basically just said that maybe there should be some kind of wall of separation. But he really meant a separation between the national government and the states. Because after all, some of the states actually had actual religions. They were state-sponsored religions. So he was just simply saying, the federal government is not going to do that. There's no religious test for office, and anybody of any religious or no religion at all can actually serve. Well, the idea was kind of dropped. I mean, you can go through the rest of the 18th century, 19th century, 20th century, and really not find any reference of any significance to the Danbury letter. I mean, there is one phrase in 1879, but nothing significant until you come to 1947. That's where Justice Hugo Black revived this and said that the First Amendment was intended to erect a wall of separation between church and state. Well, that started us down, I think, the wrong road of saying that then we cannot necessarily allow anything religious in the public sphere. That didn't really surface in 1947, and even 10 years later it didn't really surface, but eventually we get to the prayer case of 62, we get to the Bible reading case of 63. By the time we get to 1980, the Supreme Court rules you can't even post the 10 Commandments in a classroom in Kentucky. By the way, that 10 Commandments is still posted, I've understood, but nevertheless, that's where our friends from the freedom from religion are getting their idea. But is that constitutional? No, because really the First Amendment actually deals with this in two very significant ways. It certainly says that Congress shall make no law establishing religion. So we cannot establish or sponsor religion, but at the same time it cannot prohibit the free exercise of religion. And as Larry was pointing out, I think very accurately, as soon as you believe that we have free exercise, then I should have the freedom to exercise my religion. The line, I think, should be drawn the way it's drawn these days between sponsorship and accommodation. If you were to say, look, we're going to sponsor a particular religious view in the public schools, or an agent of the state, that could be a teacher or an administrator, says we're only going to allow Christian views, or we're only going to have an opportunity for Christian prayers, well, then you got a problem there. Or likewise, if you say we're only going to allow Muslim prayers, we're only going to allow for a Muslim prayer room, but no other, that would be sponsorship. But on the other hand, we should have accommodation, free exercise. So one of the things that public schools have done for years is said we have a free access, an equal access kind of law that says, look, if you have a debate club, or you have a ski club, or you have a golf club, you could also have a Bible club. They have to abide by the same rules as anybody else, but we can't exclude them just because they want to get together and read the Bible. And so that, I think, is the difference between the freedom of religion and the freedom from religion. Our friends in Wisconsin actually want to say, we don't want religion anywhere. We don't want to even run into the possibility of seeing something religious in the public arena. We would like to tear down all the crosses, all religious symbols, because we believe we should have freedom from religion. But that's not what the Supreme Court has ruled in many of these cases. That's not what the framers intended with the First Amendment. And frankly, that's not even what Thomas Jefferson intended when he talked about this idea of a wall of separation. So, again, I've given you a very short and probably too simplistic a summary of that chapter, but it gives you a little bit of a handle on the differences between the freedom from religion and the freedom of religion. The freedom from religion is not in the First Amendment, because the First Amendment says you should not establish religion. So we should prohibit the establishment of a religion, but we also cannot prohibit the free exercise of religion. And so that's just a brief look at that very important issue. Let's come back, and we're going to talk with our friend John Whitehead, the founder of the Rutherford Institute. He is the author of a number of books. We're going to talk about surveillance and privacy. And most importantly, I suspect you'll have some questions. So if you'd like to give us a call, that number 1-800-351-1212. We'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, for the last few decades, politicians and high-tech companies have been talking about the digital divide. They wanted to make sure that poor and underprivileged students have access to the same digital devices as wealthier ones. I've always felt that there was a bigger issue that fewer people were talking about. Fortunately, Naomi Schaefer Riley addresses this in her New York Times op-ed on America's Real Digital Divide. She warns that if you think middle-class children are being harmed by too much screen time, just consider how much greater the damage is to minority and disadvantaged kids who spend much more time in front of screens. One study, for example, found that minority children watch 50% more TV than their white peers. They use computers for up to 1.5 hours longer each day, and the amount of time black and Hispanic children spend in front of any screen is substantially longer each day than for white children. Another study found that every additional hour of TV increased a child's odds of attention problems by about 10%. Kids who watched 3 hours a day were 30% more likely to have attention problems than those who watched none. The push from politicians and educators has been to bridge the digital divide and get computers and other technology into the classrooms. Apparently, minority students already have access to technology. One Pew Research report documents that African American teenagers are more likely to own a smartphone than any other group of teenagers in America. Put simply, the problem today is not a lack of technology in the schools, in the homes, in the hands of young people. The problem is too much technology. They're spending a significant number of hours each day in front of a TV screen, a video game screen, a computer screen, and a smartphone screen. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
From PureFlix, the biblical story of the last of the Hebrew judges, Samson. Rated PG-13. Samson, now playing. Information at samson.movie.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
One of the things we're going to be talking about now is surveillance and privacy. We've posted one of the articles by John Whitehead that came out last June. He also had one in December, and also one by John Castle, which we'll get to in just a minute. Where's the liberal outrage over civil liberties in the Flynn case? And again, if you are not familiar with John Whitehead, you haven't been listening to Point of View, because we quote him, and of course have had him on a number of times as well. Constitutional attorney and an individual that has really been looking at constitutional law and human rights. Those of you watching online, let me hold up a couple of the books. First of all, A Government of Wolves, The Emerging American Police State, and another book that I would recommend by him as well, Battlefield America, The War on the American People. Two different books. Of course, he's written over 30 books, but these are certainly in the issue of surveillance, which has been in the news quite a bit. But again, it's one of the reasons why we wanted to come back and educate you about this very important issue. John Whitehead, thank you once again for joining us on Point of View.
Hey, thanks for having me on, sir.
You know, your article a while back had a quote from William O. Douglas, but this was in 1966, in which he said, "We're rapidly entering the age of no privacy, where everyone is open to surveillance at all times, where there are no secrets from government." Well, he wrote that in 1966. He can't even imagine the world that we live in today here in the 21st century, could he?
No, what he saw, though, in his day was it was the 1950s, what they call the age of McCarthyism, where the FBI was tapping telephone calls of virtually anyone they suspected to be a so-called communist, which was somebody they disagreed with. Martin Luther King, the FBI downloaded 17,000 pages of information on him to try to stop his work. So the age of surveillance has been here for a while. The thing now is that it's so highly tech now, artificial intelligence. I mean, how many people realize, and this has just been reported recently, that when you with your Twitter accounts, 20% of those responses you get are from robots.
Wow.
So they're calling them bots now, Twitter bots. Artificial intelligence is doing algorithms on all of us on Facebook. So if you're really careful, like I say, sometimes I'll go on, when I'm on my news feed on Facebook, I'll click onto an article and go back 2 minutes later, and there's four other articles just like it. So they're watching everything we do. Amazon, by the way, built a $600 million intelligence cloud for all 17 intelligence agencies. CIA, NSA, down the list. And they work with Google, they work with Facebook, they work with Amazon, and everything you're doing is being watched now. And here's the scary thing. It's one scary thing, but there are plenty of them. The Department of Homeland Security now is doing threat assessments on everybody's home in America. A threat assessment is how dangerous are you, and they're doing it based on their surveillance.
Wow.
Threat assessments go from green to red, and you could be put now on what they call hot lists if you're dangerous. For example, if you own a legal firearm, a hunting rifle, your threat assessment jumps, could go to red. And there are 80,000 SWAT team raids that occur across America, and they're growing, where they're crashing through doors in the middle of the night. I get the case. I have policemen talk to me now, right? Good policemen who are really nervous about the SWAT team raids. And sometimes when they're really agitated and they come to your door, it's because they now have a threat assessment on you.
Yes.
You could
they know that you have
paid a parking ticket.
Yeah. Yeah.
Your threat assessment goes up.
Let's, if we can, just also, too, get into something in this article that might actually be a surprise to our listeners, and that is the government is finding ways to get around what they call inconvenient laws, and they do that by actually hiding some of their clandestine activities or by putting their servers and other things overseas. Now, we've seen that with torture programs. We will, if you will, export our torture programs so we can torture people off of American soil and get away with some things.
Yeah.
But that's happening now with some of this surveillance, isn't it?
Yeah, the NSA now, what they call diverting internet traffic is what they call it. They'll send all the information they collect. They collect about 2 billion emails a day from us. They'll send them overseas. That way, and this was helped by the Obama administration, an executive order called 12333. It authorized the collection of America's data from surveillance conducted on foreign soil. As soon as they got that green light from Obama, they started funneling all information they're collecting on us over to computers in Britain and other countries. And what are they evading? The inconvenient law is the Fourth Amendment. The Fourth Amendment to our Constitution says you cannot do surveillance on us unless they have probable cause,
right?
Which means some form of illegality. The problem is now they're collecting everything because they want to know exactly what we're doing, and it's all about control. And the thing that I'm seeing, and when I talk to people, and I'm former military people coming out of top secret programs. By the way, I'm a former military myself, by the way. I worked in top secret projects.
Yes.
They're telling me stuff. They're saying that we're worried what's going to happen. And the Pentagon put out that video. They're predicting by 2025 this country's going to break down economically, socially, or whatever, and they're going to have to impose martial law. I did a podcast, by the way. You can go to our website at rutherford.org and take a look at it. But they're predicting, and they think it's going to happen. They really do, top brass, that this country's going to break down, and they're going to have riots. And what I'm seeing in recent news, like in San Francisco and Los Angeles, with homeless people laying around the sidewalks now. I talk to law students. I'm a lawyer. They come into work with me in my summer intern program. They can't get jobs. So something's going on in the country. Amazon stores you see the shopping malls are closing down. Something's up. But they need this surveillance, the government. I would call them paranoid, so that in an event of a huge crisis, they can move them in. And you know something, folks? They can do it because they've now got local police that work with the military. They look like the military, and they're doing these SWAT team raids, and they're ready to go.
Let's, if we can, also talk about the assumption that I think people are making naively, that if I've got a Google account, I've got a Yahoo account, well, the government isn't hacking into and collecting that information, but your article actually documents how that actually is taking place.
They're not really hacking. Google gives it over. Google works with the government. Facebook works with the government. They get contracts. Amazon got $600 million, like I said, to build what? An intelligence cloud, which, by the way, Amazon has access to Netflix and a number of corporations with signed contracts. So information they're collecting, they're swapping it. We live in a corporate surveillance state. That's the term I would use. And they know everything we're doing, folks. I mean, with all the things that are coming, and I'm saying, really, artificial intelligence, and a number of people, Elon Musk of Tesla, they're raising the concern. They're saying we better back off of this stuff. I don't know if you saw recently, the Pentagon announced they're using now robots in warfare overseas.
Yes.
And by the way, everything we're seeing today, the SWAT team raids, the Kelbar, the AK-47s, all the things, the flashbang grenades, those are all used in the military. They come back home, folks. We're going to see that here. So I'm trying to warn people. I'm trying to get people up on their feet at their local governments and say, listen, we need to do something about this. But Congress is not really going to help you, in my opinion.
Well,
you can ask me why if you want.
Yeah. Well, and again, when we come back from the break, I want to talk a little bit about how did we get here? Because, first of all, you and I have talked about the Patriot Act, and there was a time in which at least the people at the polls, whether it was Ron Wyden on one side or Rand Paul on the other, those are two individuals that disagree politically but agreed with some of the concerns about the Patriot Act or the U.S. Freedom Act. And one of the articles I've posted comes from John Cass in the Chicago Tribune, and I love it. You know, what happened to liberal Democrats with their concerns about civil liberties and government surveillance of American citizens? Yeah. He said liberals once hated the CIA. They love the Russians. You can look it up, he says. The liberal friends in Hollywood made movie after movie about the dangers of the deep state and its awesome surveillance powers. Of course, the point he's making is right now, since it's going after Donald Trump or Michael Flynn or Jeff Sessions, a lot of liberals that used to be concerned about this have turned a blind eye. So let's take a break. And we go to a break. Let me just mention that we do have a link to John Whitehead's website, which is called Rutherford.org. It's the Rutherford Institute. You're going to find all sorts of resources there. We've posted, of course, one of his articles here on surveillance and no privacy, but you can find all of his articles that are there, and we'll get into a little bit more about some of the most recent things he said about the budget and military spending and the military-industrial complex and much, much more. So it's all available at our website, or you can just go directly to his website, Rutherford.org. You might also find some of the information that he has there in terms of legal assistance, the newsroom, some of the resources, and, of course, some of the videos and podcasts, which we've been referring to as well. So let's take a break, focusing on surveillance. As a matter of fact, as I mentioned just a few minutes ago, we make these booklets available from time to time. We've done them on Sharia law. We've done them on making your vote count. Well, the next one coming out is on surveillance and privacy, because we think this is a big issue. It's not new. We were talking about this in the 1990s, but now a lot of people seem to have turned a blind eye to it. So we'll talk about how that developed. And, of course, we'll take your phone calls. We've already got some calls coming in. So if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Privileged to have with us today John Whitehead of the Rutherford Institute. And if you would like to know more about him or some of the articles we're quoting from today, they're all available at our website, pointofview.net. Let's take a break. We will take your phone calls, 800-351-1212, and continue our conversation with John Whitehead right after this.
Is religious freedom still a cornerstone of the republic, or has it effectively been crushed by the forces of tolerance? America needs Christians to be informed and as unified as possible, applying God's wisdom to civic life. Point of View can be a key part of a successful mission. I believe in America. I believe God wants His best for us. We can face whatever the world throws at us as long as we stand together. If you have not signed on, please do it now. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. Pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Or call us 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with John Whitehead, and let me again commend to you his books, A Government of Wolves, The Emerging American Police State, Battlefield America, The War on the American People. Now, those are a few years old, so that's why you also want to make sure you go to rutherford.org and see some of the updates and some of the new information. Posted one of his articles on surveillance and no privacy. I want to get into how we got here, but let's take some phone calls along the way as well. So we'll head up to Maine, WSEW. Bob, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Hi, thank you so much for your show. I wonder if your guest, John, could speak to the E-Verified biometric ID that's proposed as part of H.R. 4760, which may be current in the House. It's also called the Securing America Future Act of 2018. It's recommended that the ID is going to be for every legitimate resident of the United States, I believe. Thank you.
So it's kind of like, remember in East Germany, they say, we need to see your papers. What about this?
Oh, it's coming, yeah. The Real ID Act, all that stuff. Biometrics are coming. They're arguing now in some quarters in the government whether or not they should actually putting implants in people, biometric implants.
Here we
All
go.
that's coming, I think, for children in the future. There's no doubt about that. We're moving in that direction. Is there any way to shift? I don't know. Like I say, some of the biggest names in technology now, like Elon Musk, are saying, pull back on this stuff. It's going to destroy people. And that's exactly where we're headed. I mean, I'm telling people, and again, I'm a researcher, writer, where we're headed with artificial intelligence, I mean, everything is controlled by that now. So every time you, Zuckerberg or Facebook, he laughed not too long ago and said, I know when you get up, I know when you leave for work, I know when you're going here and I'm going there. And with all this facial recognition software being the local police now on their body cameras, they're going to be able to scan a crowd and pick you out if they want to get you for something. With the Stingray devices local police have now, they drive in front of your home. They're little boxes that act as fake cell phone towers and downloading all your phone calls. So everything you're doing is being watched. And the question is, why are they wanting to watch you? There's a fear that there might be an uprising. And I have people who call me, former veterans, by the way. I work with a lot of former veterans who say, we'd like to grab our gun and fight this back. I say, hey, the local police they'll know before you even arrive what you're thinking. And they have enough firepower to blow you away. That's not going to work because, again, they're watching everything. I mean, how many people know that the post office records 160 billion pieces of mail annually? They're X-raying our mail now. They're watching everything we're doing, and biometrics and all this stuff is the future. I mean, they're using facial recognition software at many airports now. They want to know where you're at, what you're doing. I mean, how many people know that there are over 70 fusion centers in America? They're run by the military. They're in different towns across the country, and they collect all the information. When you drive into a city, for example, with your cell phone, they know where you stop, where you shop, where you go, and what you say.
And again, you can watch some of these YouTube videos that show that. So, you go.
It's happened. It's here. I mean, people say, when is the future going to be here? And I'm looking them in the eye and say, haven't you kept up with it?
It is here.
And here's the other thing, and here's an axiom I'm telling your listeners. When the government starts talking about it, like this may come, it's already come. When they say that, you see articles about Twitter bots that are conversing with people, that means that there's a lot more going on than we know about. And so be alert when you see articles. And I'm telling people, you can watch a lot of television, but you should be going and reading what's happening here and there and keep up in your community. If you care about your children, your grandchildren, you better get educated. Education precedes action.
For sure. Let me just for a minute go to this one piece that I posted by John Cass, because I appreciate the fact that there are some liberals that are saying, what happened? I mean, he said liberals once hated the CIA. We love the Russians. Years ago, Edward Snowden became a liberal demagogue, and WikiLeaks, with their winged chariot of truth, liberals fretted about the powers of the intelligence community. But now, when they eavesdrop on, in this particular case, Michael Flynn, when you have transcripts of what Flynn said to the Russian ambassador, when you have transcripts of what the president said to the Australian ambassador, where are our liberal friends who used to be so concerned about these issues?
That's one issue I raise to people. Once you get into politics, you lose freedom. Freedom is a human issue. It's not a political issue. I mean, either it's right or it's wrong. Is it right for the government to eavesdrop on anybody without a warrant? No. And so people are willing to throw away their rights. I'm seeing it. You're seeing it with so-called liberals now. They're throwing it away. Why? Because they want a political objective. Once you start down that road, again, it's a human rights issue. It's not a political issue. Once you go down that road, they're laughing.
Well, again, this...
And what's called the deep state? By the way, I'm one of the first people to write about the deep state.
That's right. Talk about that.
Yeah. Some emails surfaced about a group that's on the 7th floor of the Defense Department. It's called the 7th Floor Group, and later they referred to it as the deep state. These are people supposedly power brokers, corporate entities, government officials that basically run what's going on in government. They decide what's going to happen. It isn't your local congressman who spends basically sometimes 2 days a week at a phone bank trying to raise money for the next campaign. As you see, they're not protecting us. How many people out there really think that your congressman's protecting you? No, they're not. And that gets back to another important axiom when we're dealing with freedom. Freedom starts with you. Democracy starts with you. It starts with you getting up and getting mad and saying, I'm going to go down to my local government. I'm going to get a hold of this congressman who's been dodging me for 2 years now. I won't answer my emails.
Mm-hmm.
It takes what some of the great activists of the past did. They decide, hey, I'm going to get me 500 people or 1,000 people and march on Washington. And they don't like that, by the way.
Yes.
Basically, a lot of people in power do not like the First Amendment right to assemble and, petition the government for a redress of grievances.
Let's take some more phone calls. And this one, I think, is on the Second Amendment. But Stacy in South Carolina, WAGP, what would you like to ask today?
Thank you for taking my call. I was listening to Glenn Beck and his co-hosts were talking, and they were talking about these assault rifles, and they were saying that it wasn't, they were talking about the Second Amendment, and they said the Second Amendment's not so much about us, being allowed to hunt or even defending ourselves or our family. It's more along the lines of protecting us from a tyrannical government or, government coming after us. So based on Mr. Whitehead's comment earlier about how, if you have a weapon and you're thinking about, overthrowing the government or whatever, they'll know ahead of time what you're thinking. Does it make sense? I mean, I know we have the right to bear arms, and there's a debate on whether or not people should have semi-automatic or assault rifles. But in his opinion, does he think that if we have them, would it make a difference? Would it not if the government decides one day to, take over?
Yeah, again, a lot of it you have to say, who's the government? I mean, I think there's some people that are in the police force right now that don't like some of the trends that are happening even in their own departments. What are your thoughts about that?
My thoughts are it'd be very, very difficult with how armed local police are now. They work with the FBI, many of the police chiefs. I think we're at what I would call it's like you're walking toward a cliff, and nobody seems to be noticing that the cliff's up ahead, and it is. If you're going to have any kind of change, people are going to have to get educated really quick. Like I'm saying, the government's predicting by 2025, that is, 7 years away, we could have a total breakdown in America.
Wow.
In the major cities. They're ready. So the question is the Second Amendment was written to protect you in your home. But today, with the SWAT team raids and all the things that we're seeing and all the armed, the police have all these weapons. They have flashbang grenades, they have grenade launchers, they have armored vehicles. We don't have any of that. I mean, it's changed. And who's the fault? We let them have it. How many people have gone down to City Hall, and there's some local communities have done this, they barred it. They said, we will not allow our police to have military equipment. That's the way to do it. Get down to your local government, protest it, get a law passed. And I've seen that happen in some communities across the country. But it would, and that would send shockwaves across the country. If maybe 20 towns would pass laws like that, maybe that congressman up there who's sitting around with his all the perks he gets might wake up and go, oh, okay, maybe I should do something about this. You got to get their attention.
Well, again, for information, go to rutherford.org, and there's great material, as well as when we come back from the break, I'll read from some of your books, but I wanted to honor my commitment to having you on for half an hour. And so, John Whitehead, we learn so much from you every single time. Thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you, sir.
We will come back and take some more of those phone calls right after these important messages.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. It's not every day that the governor of a state finds himself behind the pulpit of a church, but I guess not every state is Texas. Greg Abbott, governor of the great state of Texas, joined Pastor Steve Riggle and churchgoers at Grace Community Church recently to sign a bill into law. The bill that passed at the Texas legislature made it unlawful for the government to force religious leaders to turn over copies of sermons during a civil lawsuit or administrative proceeding. And if you don't think such a law is necessary, recall that the pastor of the church Governor Abbott was in that day was asked by the mayor of Houston to turn over his sermons, even though he wasn't even party to a lawsuit. If that's not enough, recall that Dr. Eric Walsh, himself a lay minister, was fired by the state of Georgia over something he said in a sermon. And after he sued the state of Georgia, Georgia's attorney general subpoenaed copies of Dr. Walsh's sermons, sermon notes, and sermon transcripts. So the day has come in which we need laws on the books to make it clear that the state is not entitled to review a pastor's sermons. The pulpit has rightly been called the sacred desk. The promise of America has been that he who fills that desk is entitled to speak what his conscience demands. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
More people today are saying Americans don't really need religion, but America does need religion. Religion helps the economy, families, and even national security. Learn more by reading Saving America, 10 Reasons Religious Freedom is the Key to Our Nation's Future. You can download this free booklet at firstliberty.org/Saving America. That's firstliberty.org/Saving America. Discover 10 ways religion benefits America at firstliberty.org/Saving America.
Now, back to Point of View. your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Posted this article on surveillance and no privacy by John Whitehead, and you can find many other articles. I actually was going to post a whole series of them. I thought, well, this one is a good enough summary of some of the things. He has one in December saying, if you think Santa Claus sees you while you're sleeping and knows when you're awake, no, the government knows that too. I thought it was a good piece, but I didn't post that one because I wanted to put up the one by John Cass, who said, where's the liberal outrage over civil liberties? And before I take another phone call, and we'll get to Clint here in just a minute, they picture in one of his books, Battlefield America, is ominous. It shows police forces across the country, and this one comes from Montgomery County, and that is in Pennsylvania. There's a Montgomery County, Maryland. This is one in Pennsylvania. But nevertheless, it shows this tactical response team. It shows them looking like they're in Iraq, Afghanistan, or maybe almost looks more like, because of the foliage there, maybe like they're in Bosnia during the Bosnia War. And it's talking about the fact that you have military outposts, you have tanks, you have weaponry, but this is all in the hands of the police force. They have military-grade hardware, and it is a little bit chilling to say, this doesn't look like the military. This is our local police force. And again, I'm all about giving those in law enforcement the weapons and the resources they need to be effective. But this is getting a little scarier than maybe we anticipated. And again, a lot of that's documented in his book, Battlefield America. The earlier book, A Government of Wolves, the Emerging American Police State, just reminds us of how the National Security Agency has been diverting internet traffic, having servers overseas, how it's used the executive order 12333 by the Obama administration to justify all of this. And of course, I said hacking into Google and Amazon and others, and Yahoo, in most cases, they don't have to do a whole lot of hacking because a lot of it is given over voluntarily to the government. Let's get back to the phones, though, and give you a chance to make a comment or ask a question. We'll go to South Carolina on the Good News Network. Clint, what would you like to add to our conversation today?
Listening to this, it reminds me, I've got two people that I know of that have been stopped on the interstate after crossing state lines with larger amounts of cash. People don't realize that the magnetic script in money is now detectable. They've been doing it in airports since the 90s. They said it was to keep money from being trafficked and laundered. It's now also done on the interstate highways.
Isn't that something? And again, you can understand that a lot of it is trafficking, some of it is drug sales, and some of it is illegal. But let's imagine that you need to move money without using, say, some kind of security system or armored truck or something like that, from one business to the next, and you just cross a state line. You can be pulled over just like you were a drug trafficker because of the ability to track not only digital cash, but real cash. And so you can see why there has been such an interest in what we talked about programs before, cryptocurrency, Bitcoin, Litecoin, Ripple, those kinds of things, because this is a way I can transfer a large amount of cash and not have to pay a fee, number one, but number two, not have the government looking over my shoulder every time I move cash from one place to another.
Right. And the fact that now all states are going to magnetic strip on your driver's license.
Oh, sure.
That's another way to track your movements up and down the road. I mean, if they can track the script in money, then they can definitely track the magnetic strip on driver's licenses and IDs.
Sure. Well, eventually we just want to implant these chips in everybody, and then you can only buy and sell when you have those chips in you. Of course, I mean facetious, but not very. You see what we are. And again, this is John Whitehead, who 5 years ago had probably the major book on this idea of a deep state and an emerging police state. And then 3 years ago, of course, the book deals with Battlefield America, the war on the American people, what's been happening with military-grade hardware being put in the hands of law enforcement. And if indeed there is this fear, and it may be legitimate, who knows, especially since we didn't even get into the other issue that John White has written about, and that is eventually we're going to bust the budget. And can you imagine if all of a sudden people don't get their Social Security checks or they don't get their food stamps? What could happen? Or there's a major collapse, or some of the countries that are propping up the American dollar finally just say, we're not going to do that anymore. You could see the kind of turmoil that would take place in America. So they're planning for what they hope never takes place, but that's why a lot of this is being done right now.
Yeah.
Well, let's, if we can, real quickly get to one more call, since we were talking about some of the military weapons in the hands of police. And Sam, North Carolina, as I understand, you served in the military. First of all, thank you for your service, but what would you like to add to our conversation?
I think one thing that we forget about today in regard to military weapons, we have an atmosphere over that's developing in our country that's been prevalent overseas for years. I've lived in 2 foreign countries for a year or more, Dominican Republic and one where I managed the company, and the president had to go around with an entourage of military jeeps and machine guns and people standing around with AK-47 on the street. And of course, and Haiti was the same way when I was there. So I think that one thing that we have to realize in terms of gun control and what the police have and what we have with the proliferation of military-type weapons, there is no way with any amount of law or control that we can control these things. And our policemen have to have weapons that counter the weapons that have been brought across our southern border to the drug cartels.
And they're fighting a war down there. I mean, people have no idea what it's like to run into the Mexican drug cartel. I mean, it might as well be Iraq and Afghanistan, don't you think?
That's right. You're right. And like Chicago, I posted something on Facebook, and I post a lot on Twitter about this too. This morning, I posted about how many people were killed last year in Chicago. 600 people.
Yes.
All the weapons came from surrounding states because of their laws in Chicago are so strict. With that thought, hold that thought for a second. If we pass any number of laws in the United States for any place, there's weapons going to come across the border just like those came across state lines in Chicago. It's not a gun problem. It's a moral problem. Until we get this, until our country returns to God, and we start embracing moral values again, anybody that's bent on mayhem in this country, they're going to find a way to perpetrate that.
Well said. Sam, I wish I had a little more time. I'm coming to the end of the program here, but call back again, and certainly some wise counsel, especially in light of a conversation we'll probably have again sometime this week as we talk about the issue of gun control. I've got commentaries coming out next week that talk about what we could possibly do that would make a difference, but it's not focusing on the guns. It's focusing on things like the instant background checks and a variety of other things. And, of course, the ultimate answer, as we talked about with Kelly Shackelford last Friday, is a spiritual revival. So we wanted you to be aware of some of these issues involving surveillance and privacy. Those of you that are donors to Point of View, especially if you are one of those Truth Team members that give $45 a month or more, we will be sending you that booklet that I've put together on surveillance and privacy. But all of you have access to the articles we've posted today, one on surveillance and privacy, one on where's the liberal outrage, and we also have one that we talked about with Travis Weber in the first hour, fact-checking on Jimmy Kimmel and some of the issues of religious liberty. You probably heard a lot of things we've talked about today that you probably don't hear on any other talk show, and that's why I hope with your consideration, you might think about, as you go to the website, clicking on that button that says donate and say, I appreciate all the things you guys talk about every day. I'd like to send a donation and help you out. We want to thank Andrew and Steve for their help behind the scenes. Tomorrow's our Millennial Roundtable. We'll look forward to seeing you right then here on Point of View.
From PureFlix comes Samson, the biblical story of the last of the Hebrew judges.